The night Rafe Donovan walked into the Harbor Light, nobody looked up. That was the point. He had spent 22 years making sure nobody looked up. The diner sat on the edge of Halifax's waterfront, the kind of place that smelled like coffee grounds and old salt, and the particular sadness of 3 a.m. Neon signs buzzed in the window. The rain came sideways off the Atlantic, the way it always did in November, like the city itself was trying to push you back inside. Rafe took the corner booth, always with a clear line to the door, and set his phone face down on the table. The meeting was done. The Brannigan family had signed the port contracts, $20 million in logistics, laundered clean as snow by morning. He should have felt satisfied. He didn't feel anything. That was when she dropped the coffee pot. It shattered on the tile 3 feet from his table, and the girl, young, maybe 22, dark circles under her eyes that said she'd been on since the dinner rush, didn't flinch. She crouched right down and started picking up the pieces with her bare hands, and one of his men, a thick-necked associate named Brody, actually stood up like he was going to say something to her about the mess. Rafe raised one finger. Brody sat back down. The girl didn't notice any of it. She was talking quietly to herself, or maybe to the floor, something under her breath that sounded like, "Come on, come on, come on." Her name tag read Wren. The W was half peeled off. The shift manager appeared from the kitchen, a red-faced man in his 50s, who looked at the broken glass and then looked at Wren Callahan like she was the broken glass. "That's the second time this week," he said. "I know," she said. "I'll pay for it." "You'll pay for it out of your tips, which means you've basically worked tonight for nothing." She didn't argue. She just kept picking up the pieces, and Rafe watched her hands, careful, methodical, the way someone moves when they're used to cleaning up damage that isn't entirely their fault. And he thought about something he hadn't thought about in a long time. He pushed it back down. Ordered black coffee. Went back to his phone. He was almost out the door 40 minutes later when he felt the wallet go. He felt it the way you feel a splinter, that specific wrong absence. His hand moved to his jacket pocket before he'd even processed the thought, and there was nothing there. And he turned around in the doorway, and the diner was nearly empty. 2 old men at the counter, a couple in the back. The girl, Wren, clearing the booth he'd just vacated. She had something in her hand, not hiding it, not running, just standing there with it, looking at it with an expression he couldn't read from across the room. Rafe walked back. He stopped 2 feet away. "That's mine," he said. She looked up. She wasn't afraid of him, which was unusual. Most people got afraid when Rafe Donovan stood close to them, even people who didn't know who he was. Something in the posture, the stillness, the way he took up space in a room. But Wren Callahan looked at him the way you look at a stranger on a bus, cautious, measuring, not panicked. "I found it under the booth," she said. "I was going to hand it to Jerry at the register." He held out his hand. She gave it to him. But as she did, something slipped out from between the leather folds and fell face up on the tile between them. A photograph. Not the wallet. The photograph. Rafe looked at it for 3 full seconds before he picked it up, and in those 3 seconds the entire shape of his evening, of his life maybe, shifted without warning. Like ice moving under weight it was never meant to hold. It was a picture of 2 children. A boy, maybe 9, with a gap-toothed smile and a red wool sweater 2 sizes too large, and a girl beside him, smaller, maybe 6 or 7, holding the boy's hand with both of hers the way small children do when they mean it. Behind them, a painted mural of a lighthouse, the kind you see in church basements and community halls, and Rafe's chest did something strange, the kind they painted on the wall of the East Wing at St. Brendan's Home for Children in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, in 1998. He had not thought about St. Brendan's in 15 years. He picked up the photograph. His hands, for the first time in a very long time, were not entirely steady. Why does a waitress at a Halifax waterfront diner carry a 25-year-old photograph of 2 orphaned children? And why did the boy in that photograph have a crescent-shaped scar on his left hand? The same scar that Rafe Donovan had been looking at on his own knuckle since he was 9 years old. If you're new here, welcome to Ella's Romance Library, where every story starts with one impossible coincidence and ends somewhere that'll stay with you for days. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Rafe didn't sleep that night. He sat in the leather chair in his office on the 14th floor of the Donovan Group building, with the photograph on the desk in front of him and a glass of scotch untouched beside it, and he thought about what he actually remembered from St. Brendan's. Not much. He'd only been there 8 months before his uncle Connor had pulled him out of the system. 8 months, age 8 to 9, after his mother died and before Connor had decided, for reasons Rafe now understood completely, that a boy with the Donovan name needed to be raised inside the family, not outside it. He remembered the lighthouse mural. He remembered the smell of the place, industrial soap and old wood, and the particular loneliness of 100 children pretending they weren't lonely. He remembered a social worker named Margaret, who called everyone Little Duck, and he remembered vaguely the way the smaller kids used to follow him around, because he was one of the older ones, one of the ones who seemed like he knew what he was doing. He hadn't known what he was doing. He'd been 8. There had been a girl, small, dark-haired, very serious. She used to sit on the windowsill in the common room and look at the harbor like she was waiting for a ship. He'd asked her once what she was waiting for, and she'd said, "My mum," and he'd said, "Yeah," and they'd sat there together for a while without talking, which was the kindest thing he knew how to do at 8 years old. He didn't remember her name. He looked at the photograph. He looked at it for a very long time. By 4 in the morning, he had made a decision he would have called irrational in any other context. He picked up the phone and called his head of research, a meticulous, gray-eyed man named Fletcher, who had the social life of a monk and the information network of a small government, and told him what he needed. "The girl's name is Wren Callahan," Rafe said. "She works nights at the Harbor Light on Lower Water Street. I need to know where she came from." Fletcher didn't ask why. He never asked why. That was why Rafe kept him. The answer came back in 18 hours. Wren Adele Callahan, 23 years old, born in Dartmouth. Mother, Teresa Callahan, deceased 8 years ago, cancer. Father, unknown, never listed on the birth record. Current address, a rental above a dry cleaner on Agricola Street. Part-time nursing student, Dalhousie, 2nd year. Working double shifts at the Harbor Light to cover tuition and the rent on a second apartment. The apartment, Fletcher noted carefully, where Teresa Callahan had lived before she died, which Wren was apparently still paying for, 2 months behind, as though she hadn't entirely decided what to do about her mother being gone. And here was the thing that made Rafe set down the report and press 2 fingers against his mouth and stare at the far wall for a very long time. Teresa Callahan had, for 11 years before her death, received a monthly bank transfer from a numbered account registered to a holding company called Starpoint Trust. Rafe knew every holding company in the Donovan portfolio. Starpoint Trust was not one of them, but the account number had a routing pattern he recognized, the pattern his father's financial officer had used in 2003, before everything fell apart, before the fire at the Donovan compound outside Truro, before Marcus Donovan was declared legally dead and Rafe, 16 years old, had stood at an empty grave in the rain and told himself he was done crying. He called Fletcher back. "The Starpoint account," he said. "I need to know who set it up, and I need to know if Marcus Donovan's name is anywhere near it." Fletcher was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's a different kind of question than the others. I know, that's a question that could make certain people uncomfortable. Fletcher, I'll have it by morning. Here's what you need to understand about Wren Callahan and why she matters. She was not the kind of person who made scenes. She was the kind of person who absorbed them. The difficult table that stayed past close. The manager who docked her pay for a broken coffee pot that had a cracked handle to begin with. The landlord who charged her a late fee on an apartment she was keeping out of love for a woman who was already gone. She absorbed all of it and she kept moving, because Teresa Callahan had raised her daughter to be the person who stayed standing, and Wren intended to honor that. But she was not soft. People mistook the stillness for softness. They were wrong. When a black SUV pulled up outside the Harbor Light on her Thursday closing shift, and a woman in a charcoal coat stepped out and said that Mr. Donovan would like a word, Wren looked at the woman for a long moment and then said, "Mr. Donovan can come inside like everyone else." There was a pause. Rafe stepped out of the SUV. He was taller than she'd remembered from the other night, Or maybe it was just that in the rain and neon of the waterfront, he looked less like a man who happened to be sitting in a diner, and more like a man who was used to cities doing what he wanted. He wore a dark coat and no expression. He looked at her through the window of the harbor light like she was a problem he was still deciding how to solve. Then he came inside. He sat at the counter, not the corner booth, which surprised her. She poured him coffee without being asked, because it was 11 p.m. And he looked like someone who needed it, and she said, "You're here about the photograph." "Yes. You could have just asked me about it the other night." I didn't know what questions to ask yet. She pulled the photograph from the pocket of her apron. She'd kept it. She wasn't sure why, some instinct she'd been trying to explain to herself for 2 days. She set it on the counter between them. "My mother gave it to me," she said. "Before she died, she told me it was important. She told me that if anything ever happened to her, I should find the boy with the scar on his hand." She paused. I thought she was confused. The morphine was very high by then. Rafe looked at his left hand, at the crescent-shaped scar, pale against his skin, from a fall off a bicycle in 1997 that he still remembered in specific detail because no one had come when he cried. "She wasn't confused," he said. Wren looked at him. "No," she said slowly. "I'm starting to think she wasn't." And then Rafe Donovan, who had not told another person a true thing about himself in 15 years, told her about the photograph, about St. Brendan's, about the girl on the windowsill who waited for a ship, about the fire at the Truro compound, and the empty grave, and his father, and the account number with a routing pattern he recognized from a dead man's books. He told her because she had kept the photograph, because she had not run, because she looked at him like she was trying to solve the same problem from a different direction, and he was tired, bone-tired, in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, of being the only person in any room who knew the whole shape of things. When he finished, Wren was quiet for a long moment. "Starpoint," she said finally. "You know it? My mother used to say it, when I was little. She'd say the Starpoint takes care of us, and I thought she meant the stars. I was 4. A beat. Later I thought it was just something she said when things were hard, when we didn't have enough." She looked at the photograph again, at the small dark-haired girl holding the boy's hand. "That's me," she said. It wasn't a question. "I think so. And that's you." "Yes." She picked up the photograph and held it in both hands, the way the girl in the picture was holding the boy's hand, careful and certain, and with a seriousness that had nothing to do with age. "Your father's been sending my mother money since before I can remember," she said. "And nobody was supposed to know. No, which means somebody else found out anyway, or was always going to find out." She looked up. "You said the fire at the compound, was it investigated?" Rafe was quiet for a beat. "My Uncle Connor called it an accident. And you believed him. I was 16. What do you believe now?" The question sat between them. Rafe looked at it from all sides, the way he looked at everything, strategically, from a distance, with one eye already on the exits. But this question didn't have an exit. This question had been sitting in the back of a drawer in his chest for 20 years, and Wren Callahan had just pulled the drawer open with both hands without asking permission. "I think," he said carefully, "that my Uncle Connor had a great deal to gain from my father being dead." Wren set the photograph down. "Then we have a problem," she said. They had more than a problem. But let me tell you something about problems before we go further. In Rafe Donovan's world, a problem with a shape was better than a problem without one. A shaped problem could be solved. A shapeless one could only be survived. This one was acquiring a shape fast. Fletcher's overnight report came in at 6 in the morning, and Rafe read it in his car outside Wren's apartment building while she was upstairs changing out of her work clothes. He'd insisted on driving her home. She'd let him, which he took as a sign that she was either pragmatic or more frightened than she looked. Possibly both. The report was 4 pages. The relevant parts. Starpoint Trust had been established in 2002 by a Halifax-based lawyer named Gordon Alcott, now retired to Cape Breton. The signatory on the account, not the named trustee, but the actual signatory, the person whose authorization was required for every transaction, was listed under a legal alias that Fletcher had spent most of the night tracing through 3 shell companies and a land title in New Brunswick. The alias resolved to a man named David Merritt. David Merritt had a Nova Scotia driver's license issued in 2004, a modest house in Windsor, and a 20-year history of paying taxes on income from a consulting practice that did not appear to consult on anything. He had no social media, no professional affiliations, no apparent family. He had, however, a medical record at a Kentville clinic that listed a distinguishing physical characteristic in the patient notes: a burn scar covering the right side of his chest and shoulder, consistent with injuries sustained in a structural fire. Rafe sat in the car and looked at the screen of his phone and thought about his father's laugh, which was the only memory he had of Marcus Donovan that wasn't mediated through other people's accounts, or Connor's carefully managed version of history. Just the laugh, the way it filled a room without trying to. He thought about a man living quietly in Windsor, Nova Scotia, for 20 years. A man who had watched his son become the thing he'd built, and had sent money, month after month, to a woman in Dartmouth with a dark-haired daughter who waited on windowsills for ships to come in. He thought about Connor. His phone rang. Unknown number. He picked up. "You've been asking questions," said Connor Donovan's voice. "About old accounts." Rafe said nothing. "I always knew you'd find the thread eventually," Connor said. He didn't sound angry. He sounded almost relieved, which was worse. "You're your father's son that way. He could never leave a loose end alone either. Where is he, Connor?" A pause. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes," Rafe said. "You do." Another pause, longer this time. "There are things that needed to happen the way they happened," Connor said finally. "The family needed a clear line of succession. Your father was. Marcus had ideals that were going to get everyone killed. The war with the Brannigans alone. You set the fire." Silence. "He got out," Rafe said. "But you made sure he couldn't come back. You made sure I thought he was dead." His voice was very even. He had learned a long time ago that the evenness was more frightening than the alternatives. And when he tried to take care of the people he cared about, you watched, you let it go, because it was hidden enough, and because as long as he stayed hidden, he was no threat to you. Rafe, what changed? Why are you calling me now? Connor's breath on the line. Then, because the Brannigans found the Windsor address. I don't know how, but they move on it in 48 hours. The call ended. Rafe sat very still for approximately 4 seconds. Then he got out of the car, went upstairs, and knocked on Wren Callahan's door. She opened it in a university sweatshirt with wet hair and a mug of tea, and she looked at his face and said, "What happened?" "We need to go to Windsor," he said. "Tonight." She didn't ask why. She set down the mug, picked up her coat, and said, "Let me get my boots." That was the moment. If he were honest with himself, in the part of his chest he'd kept bricked up since he was 9 years old. That was the moment Rafe Donovan understood that this woman was not a coincidence. She was not a thread he'd pulled. She was the place the thread had always been leading, if he'd ever been willing to follow it. He was willing now. Windsor, Nova Scotia in November looks like a painting that decided not to finish itself. The Avon River runs wide and flat through the valley, the tides dramatic and unreliable, the kind of place that the rest of the province knows about in a theoretical way but rarely visits. The house on Patton Street was modest. White clapboard, a covered porch, lights on in the kitchen. The kind of house a man builds when he has given up the architecture of a previous life entirely and decided that small and true is better than large and false. Rafe sat in the car across the street for a long moment. "You don't have to go in," Wren said. "I know, but you're going to, yes." She put her hand over his briefly on the gear shift. Not a romantic gesture, something more fundamental than that. A "you're not doing this alone" gesture. He looked at it, and then at her, and then he got out of the car. He knocked on the door. It opened, and Marcus Donovan, 61 years old, gray at the temples, the right side of his neck and jaw marked by the old pale geography of a burn scar, looked at his son for the first time in 20 years. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Marcus said very quietly, "I used to practice what I would say." "What did you come up with?" Rafe said. "Nothing that seemed like enough." Rafe looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had been a ghost and was now standing in a doorway in a cardigan, with reading glasses pushed up on his head, and the particular look of someone who has been waiting for a specific knock on the door for 2 decades. The Brannigans are moving on you in 48 hours, Rafe said. We need to get you out. Marcus blinked. Then something in his face shifted, and for one moment he looked exactly like the version of himself that lived in Rafe's single remaining memory, the laugh that filled a room without trying. Well, Marcus said, you'd better come in then. Wren came in behind Rafe. Marcus looked at her, and his expression did something complicated and slow, the way expressions do when they're carrying 20 years of weight. Wren, he said, you look like your mother. Everyone says that, she said. I used to hate it. I don't anymore. Marcus nodded. He seemed to understand exactly what she meant. He put the kettle on. What happened over the next 36 hours would take longer to tell than we have time for tonight. But let me give you the shape of it, because the shape is what matters. Rafe moved his father. Quietly, efficiently, with the particular competence of a man who has spent 20 years learning how to make people disappear, now turned in a direction that didn't cost him anything to be proud of. 3 of his most trusted men, people who owed loyalty to the Donovan name before they owed it to Connor, formed a perimeter around the Windsor property while the transfer happened. The Brannigans arrived to find an empty house and a kettle that had recently been used, and a message from Rafe Donovan that the port contracts were void and the next conversation they had would be with lawyers, not associates. Connor was a problem of a different kind, but Connor was also a man who had made one miscalculation 20 years ago and had spent 2 decades making payments on it. And when Rafe sat across from him in the Donovan Group boardroom and laid out exactly what he knew and exactly what could be proved, Connor looked at the table between them for a very long time and then said, "What do you want?" Rafe said, "I want you to retire." Connor looked up. "Take the Cape Breton property," Rafe said. "Take the cottage on the island, retire, be done. If I ever hear the Brannigan name from your direction again, or the name Starpoint, or anything related to what you did in Truro in 2003, the files go to the RCMP, all of them. I've had 20 years to collect files, Connor. I have more than you think." He didn't, entirely. But Connor didn't know that. Connor retired. In March, the Starpoint account was dissolved. Marcus Donovan, David Merritt on paper for now, until the legal work was done, moved into a small house in Mahone Bay. He had a garden. He called Rafe on Sundays. They were learning slowly and imperfectly how to be 2 people who knew each other again. Wren finished her 2nd year at Dalhousie. She let the Agricola Street apartment go, the one she'd been holding for her mother, the one that had been costing her sleep and tips and peace of mind for 2 years. She packed Teresa Callahan's things carefully, the way her mother had packed everything, with attention and without waste, and she kept the things that mattered and let the rest go. It was not easy. It was necessary. It felt afterwards like something had been completed rather than lost. She still worked some shifts at the Harbour Light, not but because she had to. Rafe had made certain she didn't have to, but because she liked the 3 a.m. quality of the place, the rain against the windows, the way the harbor looked when the rest of the city was asleep. Rafe came in sometimes, always the corner booth, always black coffee, except now he looked up when she crossed the room. There was a night in early April when the rain was particularly brutal off the Atlantic, and the diner was empty, except for the 2 of them, and Jerry half asleep behind the register. And Wren sat down across from Rafe in the corner booth for the first time and put the photograph on the table between them. The 2 children, the lighthouse mural, the red wool sweater. "I've been thinking," she said. "What about?" "About the fact that we sat next to each other on that windowsill for 8 months when we were small, and then we lost each other for 24 years, and then you dropped your wallet in my section." She looked at him. "That's either the most improbable thing I've ever heard of, or it's the most inevitable." Rafe looked at the photograph, then at her. "In my experience," he said slowly, "the things that feel inevitable usually just mean you were always going to get there. You just didn't know which road." Wren picked up the photograph. The girl in it was holding the boy's hand with both of hers, the way small children do when they really mean it. "I used to think my mum was waiting for things to get easier before she told me about any of this," she said. "Now I think she was just waiting for me to be ready. Were you?" She looked at him. The man across the table, the boy in the photograph, the person who had driven through the dark to Windsor with her, without once asking her to be less than she was. "I think I'm getting there," she said. Outside, the harbor was black and wide and full of itself, the way it always was in April, on the edge of something that might finally be spring. If this story hit you somewhere real, drop a comment and tell me which moment got you. Was it the photograph, the windowsill, the knock on the door in Windsor? And if you're new here, welcome. Hit subscribe so you're here for the next one. Every story on Ella's Romance Library starts with something small: a dropped photograph, a familiar scar, a name your mother said when times were hard. And every story ends somewhere worth arriving. See you in the next one.